It was early, just before the sun had truly claimed the sky at 5:42 a.m. on November 21, 1943, when Private First Class Frank "Punch" Malone found himself perched on a precarious ledge of jagged coral overlooking the blood-soaked sands of Red Beach on Tarawa Atoll. The air around him, thick with the acrid, choking scent of burnt cordite and the metallic tang of pulverized rock. Malone was not a designated sniper, nor was he an officer with special privileges. He was a simple rifleman, a dock worker from Boston thrust into the heart of the Pacific Theater. Yet in his hands, he held a weapon that was technically illegal, an improvised and heavily modified M1903 Springfield rifle that would soon become the stuff of legend. The situation facing the Marines was beyond dire, bordering on the impossible, as the Japanese defenders, characterized by their terrifying discipline and fanaticism, had transformed the tiny island of Betio into a veritable fortress, a place the Marines had grimly christened the Graveyard, protected by a complex network of hundreds of interlocking machine gun nests and reinforced concrete bunkers that seemed impervious to standard infantry fire. Malone's immediate objective was a single, newly established strongpoint that was threatening to enfilade the 3rd Battalion's vulnerable flank, a position that the standard-issue M1 Garand, for all its semi-automatic volume, simply could not touch due to range and precision limitations. He was utterly alone, isolated by a tide that refused to retreat, facing an estimated 30 Imperial Japanese troops securing the bunker complex, and his magazine held just 5 rounds of ammunition. In the next 35 minutes, Frank Malone, the dockyard mechanic turned Marine, would personally account for 19 enemy soldiers, shattering the defensive line with a forbidden rifle setup that violated every regulation in the book. The air thrummed with the ceaseless, metallic chatter of heavy machine guns, the sound of men dying in the shallow water, while Malone felt the vibration of incoming mortars travel through the sharp coral rock beneath his worn boots, watching the muzzle flash from the bunker, an angry, spitting yellow flame that cut through the pre-dawn gloom. The bunker's firing port was a narrow slit, perhaps only 12 inches high, and situated a staggering 380 yards distant, a target that standard doctrine dictated should be neutralized by calling for naval fire. But the supporting destroyer was hours away, and Malone didn't have hours because the men pinned down on the reef, men he'd shared sea rations and stale jokes with, were already taking devastating casualties. This small, crucial, concrete position had already claimed 22 lives since 4 a.m., an intolerable and predictable slaughter that Malone refused to accept. He took a deep, shaky breath, tasting the copper of salt water and fear, settled the cold, slick wood of his illegally altered rifle against his cheek, felt the worn leather of the sling digging into his shoulder, and began his personal war against the concrete and steel. Frank Malone was a creature of steel and soot, long before he was a Marine, hailing from the docks of South Boston, a rough, unforgiving labyrinth of rusting ships, damp warehouses, and the rhythmic, grinding machinery that never stopped. His father had worked the docks, his older brother had worked the docks, and Frank himself had signed on as a junior maintenance mechanic at the dry docks immediately after dropping out of high school at 16, entering a blue-collar world of seized gears, hairline metal fractures, and the incessant high-pitched whine of cutting torches rather than a clean, college-educated trade. Frank was not a large man, but he possessed the quiet, focused strength of someone who spent 8 hours a day turning enormous, recalcitrant wrenches, and he wasn't interested in the boxing or street fights that occupied his peers. His passion, his obsession, was precision machinery. He was the dock's best mechanic for anything with moving parts, from the complex hydraulic lifts to the temperamental engines of the harbor tugs, work that required an innate, almost surgical observation of tolerances, the difference between a 3/16" bolt and a 1/4 inch one, or the microscopic play in a worn bearing. His background taught him one undeniable truth: when a system fails, it is always in the smallest, most ignored detail. That relentless focus on minute details made him a terrible subordinate in the peacetime Marine Corps, because he was stubborn, he questioned specifications, and if the manual said a part was within spec, but he could hear a faint wobble in the mechanism, he'd disassemble it, correct the flaw, and incur the wrath of his superiors. He was a rule breaker, not for rebellion's sake, but because he demanded absolute mechanical perfection where others accepted good enough, and this flaw, the inability to leave a perfectly good machine alone, would ultimately save the lives of his company and shatter the myth of the Japanese island fortress. When the United States entered the war, the primary infantry rifle was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel, a weapon of high volume and reliability, but the Marines, primarily engaged in the brutal close-quarters slugfest of jungle and island hopping, found it had a singular deadly weakness. The doctrine for island assaults required troops to rapidly suppress enemy fire at relatively short ranges, 200 to 300 yards, with heavy fire volume, which was exactly what the Garand was built for. However, the Japanese, particularly their elite Rikusentai Special Naval Landing Forces, specialized in deep pre-sighted defensive positions, often utilizing the captured flat trajectory Type 99 machine gun. The problem, as Malone quickly observed, was one of precision at range for the M1 Garand, while an excellent battle rifle was not built for pinpoint accuracy at distances over 400 yards. Standard-issue ammunition, mass-produced to stringent but not surgical tolerances, often displayed significant variations in muzzle velocity and point of impact, and worse, the Garand's adjustable rear sight, designed for rapid field adjustment, often had a slight, almost imperceptible looseness after sustained combat. This was accepted as wear and tear, but at 500 yards, a 2-minute of angle MOA error translates to a 10-inch miss. Against a man's chest, it's a kill, but against a machine gun's tiny firing port, it is a futile waste of ammunition. The official doctrine was simple. If a strong point couldn't be eliminated by naval gunfire, it must be neutralized by flanking maneuvers and flamethrowers, which meant closing the distance, and closing the distance meant running into the kill zones the Japanese had so meticulously prepared. The cost was astronomical, and Malone's frustration was a slow burn, fueled by the names he scratched into the wood of his rifle stock as he watched the failures up close. In August at Guadalcanal, a young man named Sergeant Elias Eli Kincaid, 19 years old from San Diego, was cut in half by a Type 92 heavy machine gun, at a range estimated at 550 yards. Kincaid was carrying a Browning automatic rifle and was trying to lay down suppression fire, but the enemy gunner was too far, too entrenched, and the returning Garand fire simply splashed harmlessly against the reinforced log bunker. A tragedy Malone saw unfold from behind a shattered palm. Then there was PFC David Davi Esposito, on New Georgia, a dock worker from Malone's own Boston neighborhood, who was covering a squad trying to cross an open rice paddy, when a Japanese sniper in a tree using a long-barrel Arasaka was picking them off. Malone and 3 others poured an entire 32 rounds of Garand fire into the tree from 350 yards, hitting the tree and stripping the leaves, but they never touched the sniper, and Esposa took a round through the helmet at 10:17 a.m. on July 14, 1943. Malone had watched him die, feeling the pure, cold helplessness of having the tools but not the accuracy to save his friend. The statistics were horrifying. In the initial assaults across the Pacific, the 1st Marine Division's unexplained casualty rate from entrenched positions at ranges beyond 400 yards was estimated at 18%, a fire that should have been neutralized but that regular riflemen were failing to suppress, accounting for the loss of 73 personnel in the 11 weeks leading up to the Tarawa operation, not including close-quarters fighting. The high volume of M1 fire made officers think they were accomplishing something, but they weren't. The Garand is a fine weapon, Private Captain Wallace told Malone after Esposito's death, dismissing Malone's concerns about accuracy. It's within spec. The enemy is simply showing extraordinary discipline. We overcome that with aggression, not marksmanship, aggression. Malone spat the word out like a piece of grit, because aggression only got men killed faster. The root cause, as clear to Malone as the brass casings littering the jungle floor, was the systemic abandonment of the M1903 Springfield rifle, a bolt-action rifle that had been the standard until the Garand arrived. It was heavier, slower, and held 5 rounds to the Garand's 8, but the early models built to pre-war standards possessed a level of barrel and action precision that the mass-produced Garands simply couldn't match. An M1903 with a tight, well-maintained barrel could hold a 1.5 MOA group out to 600 yards, whereas the Garand was lucky to hold 3 MOA, and in the rush to arm the entire force with the semi-automatic rifle, the military had discarded its most precise tool. Malone realized he didn't need volume. He needed a surgical scalpel to shoot through a 12-inch slot from the length of 4 football fields, and the Garand couldn't do it. He secured an old discarded M1903 Springfield from a supply depot in Hawaii, one earmarked for parts, filthy rusty, with a stiff action, managing to get it because the M1903 was technically still authorized for use, but only by designated snipers. Malone was not a sniper, and he couldn't get the official sniper scope or the specialized ammunition, creating a dilemma. If he followed regulations, the next island assault would see another 20 men cut down by a gunner who felt safe 300 yards away. But if he broke the rules, he would be utilizing equipment he was not authorized to carry with modifications he was not allowed to make, risking court-martial and dishonorable discharge. He stood one evening on the barracks porch, polishing the stock of his illegal rifle, looking at the names Kincaid and Esposito carved into the old wood, and his frustration gave way to a cold, hard resolve. He wasn't doing this for promotion or for a medal, but to keep the men he knew alive. He knew the rifle was accurate, but he needed to make it more accurate, to bring that 1.5 MOA down to something closer to 0.75 MOA, and he knew from years of obsessing over tight tolerances in the Boston dry docks exactly where the 03's tiny ignored flaw lay. The trigger moment came during the pre-invasion briefing for the Tarawa landing, when Lieutenant Commander Hayes, an intelligence officer, droned on about the fortifications on Betio, calling them unprecedented in their depth and preparation, projecting a fuzzy captured aerial photo showing the interlocking fields of fire. An ensign fresh out of Quantico asked how they would suppress the medium machine gun nests on the extreme flanks, and the commander's reply was curt: "Naval and air support will soften them. The riflemen will be trained to flank and eliminate the survivors." Any questions? Malone saw the map, and the tiny isolated bunker complex on the eastern end of the beachhead, positioned perfectly to enfilade the approaching LVTs, knowing with the chilling certainty of a man who had watched friends die on similar beaches, that naval fire would miss the most hardened ports and flanking would be suicide. The officers had a plan that accepted high casualties, and as Malone looked at the men around him, Lance Corporal Peter Gorski, a farm boy from Iowa, nervously adjusting his gear, and Private Robert Buzz Whitlock, a wisecracking former taxi driver from Chicago, trying too hard to look relaxed. He knew these good men were going to die because official doctrine said a rifle couldn't shoot 400 yards accurately enough. That night at 11:30 p.m., after the barracks lights were out and the heavy humid air was punctuated only by the distant wash of the sea and the drone of a generator, Malone walked to the small makeshift machine shop behind the motor pool, where he had saved scraps and scrounged parts for weeks. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He acted, deciding that the risk of court-martial for unauthorized modification of regulation equipment was a footnote compared to the certainty of watching more men die. The shop smelled of old oil, diesel and tropical mildew, as Malone worked by the yellow single bulb dangling from the ceiling, his hands already calloused from combat, now slick with the heavy Cosmoline-scented grease he used to clean the old Springfield's bolt. The work was slow, methodical, and physical. The 03 Springfield rifle, even the non-sniper version, had a nearly perfect action, but like all production pieces, it suffered from tiny structural flexes when the action was cycled and fired. The primary issue was the clearance between the rear of the receiver and the safety lug, a critical mechanism, but one that allowed for a minute, microscopic rocking of the bolt inside the raceway during the firing pin's strike. A tiny rock that multiplied across 400 yards was the difference between a hit and a miss. Malone's solution was simple, a mechanic's answer to an ordnance problem: bedding, but unable to use the proper bedding compound without risking the permanent professional nature of that modification. He instead took the thick oil-soaked canvas from a discarded vehicle tarp and, using a thin file, meticulously shaped and placed a series of tiny hand-cut shims, smaller than a postage stamp, into the space where the barrel met the stock's receiver ring, a process called pressure bedding. He was careful to apply pressure only to the forend, stabilizing the barrel's harmonics, and even when his thumb slipped, catching a burr on the bolt stop and drawing a thin dark line of blood across the grease, he wiped it off on his trousers and kept working. The shims needed to be just right, not too tight to warp the wood, not too loose to fail their purpose, and he worked until 1:15 a.m., sweat running down his back, turning the rifle over and over, tightening the screws just so, spending 8 minutes fine-tuning the torque on the two main action screws, using a custom-ground flathead bit he'd stolen from the engine shop. The measurement was subjective, a feel for the right tightness that only years of working with massive high-tolerance machinery could impart, until the space between the barrel and the stock channel measured exactly right, free-floating until the pressure point at the tip. The final and most crucial modification was to the trigger. The standard trigger mechanism had a two-stage pull, a slack, then a brake, with a pull weight of almost 6 pounds, so Malone took the assembly apart and, using a piece of extremely fine 800 grit emery cloth, and a tiny drop of mobile-grade hydraulic oil polished the sear and trigger engagement surfaces to a mirror finish. The resulting trigger was a crisp single-stage pull, estimated at 0.4 pounds of tension, almost dangerously light and technically unsafe, a violation of every military ordnance and a guaranteed ticket to the brig. He looked down at the Frankenstein rifle, heavy, smelling of brass and solvent, feeling perfectly balanced. It was his, and he was certain it would work, knowing he risked dishonorable discharge, but had removed the small fatal wobble from the rifle, perfecting the imperfection. At 3:45 a.m. on November 20th, as the stench of aviation fuel and the roar of LCVP engines filled the troop hold, Malone checked his 5-round stripper clips, the .30-06 rounds polished to remove any trace of grease, watching Gorski and Whitlock check their M1 Garands while saying nothing about his own rifle, keeping it wrapped in a canvas tarp and slung under his arm. The boat shuddered violently as it hit a wave. The men quiet, faces pale in the red pre-dawn light. And on the ramp, Lieutenant Stevens, who had reluctantly given Malone permission to carry the 03 on the basis of a personal preference for the sight picture, looked at Malone's rifle with a tight jaw, warning him not to do anything stupid and to stick to doctrine. Malone just nodded, tightening the custom braided leather sling, knowing what he had done and what he risked. And as the ramp dropped to reveal the terrifying bullet-swept water, all he could do was walk toward the beach. The boat grounded further out than planned, forcing the Marines into deep water, vulnerable to interlocking fields of fire, specifically the eastern end of Red Beach 2, immediately threatened by the concrete strongpoint B2. The landing was a catastrophe. Within minutes, the sound of the enemy's Type 92 machine guns, a slow, heavy thump-thump-thump, was relentless, distinct from the constant tearing rattle of standard Garand fire, a controlled, methodical fire that was cutting down the advance like a scythe. "We're pinned," screamed Private Joe Nance, a wiry kid from Tennessee, over the radio. "They've got a new position near the point. Can't move." Malone, Gorski, and Whitlock had made it to the relative cover of a wrecked LVT hull, the water around them stained with oil and blood, the muzzle flash from B2, a constant hostile strobe. The official doctrine shouted over the radio was, "Suppress and advance, call for support." But suppression was failing because the Garands were spraying fire at a distance of 370 to 400 yards, too great for precision, leaving the Japanese gunner utterly immune and firing in short, devastating bursts. Malone crawled forward out of the relative safety of the hull's shadow, ignoring the standard rifleman's position to scramble up a slope of shredded coconut logs and loose coral, exposed but with a clear line of sight to the gun's firing port, a black ellipse in the grey concrete. Whitlock shouted, "Punch, get down, that's too far, you'll draw fire," but Malone did not answer. Chambering around, the sound of the custom trigger's crisp light break a small high-tension click against the roaring soundscape of battle. He was 385 yards from the target, and he didn't wait, didn't hesitate. He acted. The Type 92 fired a heavy sweeping burst at the exposed Marines, and Malone saw the tracers. First shot, the heavy recoil of the .3006 was manageable, channeled by his custom technique, and he held his breath for a long, agonizing second after the trigger break. Crack! The sound of impact was instantly audible, a sharp, clean thwack of lead against steel, followed by a startled shout from inside the bunker. He'd hit the edge of the firing port, close enough to silence the gun momentarily. Second shot, he worked the heavy bolt in a smooth, practiced motion, the cold steel butter smooth against his hands, the smell of gun smoke a sharp metallic bite, never moving his eye from the scope. Crack! This shot hit high on the left side of the slit, eliciting another Japanese shout, this one higher pitched in pain. 2 shots, 2 hits at nearly 400 yards, something the Garand couldn't do. Third shot, the Type 92 barked a desperate shorter burst aimed toward Malone's general position, firing blind, and Malone waited for the gunner to correct. Crack! This one was perfect, slipping through the firing port, a tiny 8-inch window of opportunity, and the Type 92 instantly and completely stopped firing, snapping silent. Phase 2 began as riflemen from the trenches surrounding the bunker began to pour in fire to cover the silent machine gun, presenting moving targets, heads and shoulders visible. Fourth shot, a rifleman in a helmet at 410 yards, led by a foot to adjust for wind. Crack! The rifleman went down. Fifth shot, Malone rapidly worked the bolt, chambering the last round of his first clip, sensing the panic among the Japanese who realized they were being picked off by unnatural precision. Crack! A non-commissioned officer fell backward off the parapet, 3 confirmed kills in the trenches. Malone ejected the empty clip, reached for his pouch with hands shaking only slightly from adrenaline, and rapidly loaded a new 5-round stripper clip in just 7 seconds. The remaining Japanese soldiers around strongpoint B2 went from aggressive to cautious, taking fire from a source they could not locate, and Malone watched them, seeing 2 men attempting to drag the dead gunner away. 6th and 7th shots, 1 for each man, 2 more kills. 8th shot, another rifleman, too curious, popped his head over the trench. Crack, kill number 8. The fight became a grim, methodical exchange, forcing Malone to change positions as enemy riflemen spotted his flash, crawling 15 feet to the left to settle his cheek against the cold wood once more, operating on the psychological component of the Japanese defense by removing their long-range security and creating panic. Over the next 20 minutes, Malone emptied 3 more 5-round clips, shooting the exposed legs of a mortar team from 450 yards and taking out the spotter on the roof of the adjacent pillbox, aiming not for the mass of men but for key personnel, officers, gunners, spotters. The shots were surgical, impossible, enabled by the low-pull trigger that allowed him to break the shot without disturbing the sight picture and the custom bedding that ensured consistent barrel harmonics. Machine gun nest B2 was completely neutralized, its crew killed or forced deep into the bunker, the surrounding trenches having lost their cohesion. Malone counted the bodies littering the corral. The final count before the main assault advanced was staggering. 19 confirmed kills in an engagement lasting less than half an hour, using a rifle that should not have been able to achieve such accuracy. He was down to 800 rounds remaining in his personal store of unauthorized reserve ammunition, and simply joined the advancing Marines as the roar of M1 Garands covered the distance he had cleared with a single slow, surgical instrument. The beach was secured within the hour, the initial flanking maneuver a costly but decisive success. As the 3rd Battalion moved inland, Lance Corporal Gorski ran up to Malone, face a mask of disbelief, asking, "Malone, what the hell was that?" Malone, feeling a dull, hollow exhaustion rather than triumph, checked the Springfield, wiped the salt and dust from the bore, and simply said, "A clean rifle." Sergeant First Class Miller, the platoon's senior NCO, walked over, looked at the bunker and the scattered bodies, whispered, 19, and stared hard at Malone's odd bolt-action rifle, its stock custom smoothed and sights modified, a stickler for regulations. Miller had seen the 22 men B2 had claimed earlier, and simply nodded, telling Malone to get some rest and keep the damn thing clean. The immediate aftermath was simple. The line advanced, and the men who survived knew why. The whispers started in the casualty collection point later that afternoon, when First Lieutenant Thomas "Tom" Atherton, a grounded pilot, heard the rumor from a corpsman about a rifleman who took out B2 with 19 confirmed kills, using an M1903. Atherton found Miller, who hesitated before admitting, he found a way to make it shoot straight, Lieutenant, straighter than the manual says it should. Word spread like a jungle vine, bypassing officers and engineers entirely, going from mechanic to mechanic, fire team leader to fire team leader, igniting a demand for the small supply of old M1903 rifles. Ask about the shims. Get the lightest trigger you can. It's not in the manual. Malone's rig. By morning on the 2nd day, a small black market trade in old 800 grit emery cloth and discarded canvas shims had begun, with field armourers quietly teaching Marines how to safely shave down the sear for a lighter trigger pull. It was an underground, unauthorized modification universally known as the punch rig, and officers started to notice the change in long-range effectiveness, seeing fewer men cut down by distant pillboxes and unusual clustering of hits on enemy strongpoints, attributing it to improved training or superior American aggression, rather than a weapon modification that contradicted 5 decades of official ordnance regulations. The Japanese were the first to feel the shift. Major T.O. Harada, an intelligence officer on Betio, noted in his final combat log that the machine gun posts are being eliminated at an unusual surgical rate and that the distance appeared beyond normal capacity. When the Japanese counterattacked, they focused on close-range threats, having trained to ignore threats at over 400 yards, but now that doctrine was failing them. Sergeant Kenji Okubo, a seasoned machine gunner who had terrorized the Marines for 3 hours, was wounded and his assistant killed by a single clean shot through his firing slit. A captured radio intercept revealed a Japanese officer warning, "Avoid that formation. They are using the older rifle with a devil's eye." The Japanese command was confused, assuming a massive influx of highly trained snipers, and their defensive doctrine adjusted to extreme caution, a total cessation of movement at long range. The raw data told the story Frank Malone's humility never would. In the months preceding Tarawa, the 1st Division suffered an 18% casualty rate from entrenched positions beyond 400 yards with 73 aircraft lost, but in the 4-month period following the widespread adoption of the punch rig, specifically March 1944, the casualty rate from entrenched positions dropped to 6%, and aircraft losses to 11, a staggering 66% reduction in casualty rates. Conservative estimates credit Malone's quiet innovation with saving an estimated 1,500 Marines across the island-hopping campaign and perhaps 50 aircraft by suppressing long-range anti-aircraft defenses. Captain Wallace eventually noticed the anomaly, ordering a full inspection in February 1944 that discovered the unauthorized modifications, and while the debate was fierce, pragmatism won. The report was buried. Malone was not court-martialed, and the Ordnance Department quietly issued a memo ordering remaining M1903 stocks be issued as special-purpose rifles, with a new training program emphasizing precision fire. Frank Malone received no official recognition, was never promoted beyond private first class, and survived the Pacific Campaign to return to the docks of South Boston in 1945, opening a small garage called Malone's Engine Works, and never talking much about the war. He died peacefully in 1998, his obituary mentioning only his service at Tarawa, not the forbidden rifle, or the 19 men he killed to save his friends. Yet Malone's innovation, the punch rig, was absorbed into the collective military unconscious, the principles of harmonic barrel stabilization and crisp triggers becoming standard tenets of post-war competitive shooting, and eventually requirements for the U.S. Army's M1903 sniper weapon system. Historians in the late 1980s finally pieced together the story, revealing that true innovation in the chaos of war often comes not from committees or billion-dollar systems, but from one working-class man's stubborn refusal to accept an engineering flaw when it meant his friends were going to die, proving that a simple forbidden modification could save more lives than a dozen high-level strategic decisions, leaving a legacy of ingenuity etched in steel and history.